Hi everyone, this is Nish Dubashia. He's an independent scholar, writer, and integral thinker. He's author of The Unity of Everything, a conversation with David Bohm. He's based in the UK. Nish, thank you for your time. I've watched some of your content. It's very intriguing. And I can see that you have done a lot of work on the diamond model.
Well, thank you very much, Suma. It's really lovely to meet you and really nice to be here. Thank you.
Can you share more about how about your background and how you came up with this diamond model?
Yes, of course. So, I mean, I'll give you a quick bio and how it led up to the creation of what has now come to be known as the diamond model. So, basically, I was born in the UK. I live in the UK. I'm a second generation immigrant. So my parents came from India. So I was born into a Hindu family. And from a very young age, I was exposed to a lot of Hindu mythology and Hindu spirituality. So I got very interested in that very early. And also because I was being brought up in the UK, I also became exposed to Christianity as well at a very early age. So I was reading the Bible and so on. And so at quite an early age, I became interested in different religions and what is it that they might have in common. Is there like a common pattern, a common underlying teaching behind all of them? And because if there is, then maybe that's telling us something very important. So I was very interested in mathematics as I was growing up. That was kind of my favorite subject, and I had some degree of ability at that. So I ended up going to the University of Warwick to study mathematics. And while I was there, my interest in the Eastern mystical traditions really started to develop and deepen. So I came across the teachings of Krishnamurti. And through the teachings of Krishnamurti, I came across the writings of a physicist called David Bohm, who had actually worked with Einstein and was one of the really prominent physicists of the 20th century. So after leaving university, I started working in London. I started studying under various spiritual teachers, mainly Buddhist and Taoist at that point. And I launched myself into a really detailed study of the different traditions and what they might actually have in common. And I also felt that maybe some of David Bohm's ideas of that he was coming to from his work in physics might also give some insight into what this underlying unity of all religions might actually be. So I was about 23, and literally I used to practice yoga quite seriously. So I was practicing yoga in the morning and doing a hatha yoga and a meditation session. And almost out of nowhere, this picture of a diamond came to my mind. So I felt, okay, this is interesting. So I went and sat at my desk and started drawing out what I seemed to be seeing in my mind. And that's how quite quickly they developed this pattern that later came to be called the diamond model, which I felt might hold the key to what it is that is the perennial philosophy, what it is that's lying at the absolute root of all of the different traditions and teachers and so on. And I wrote a paper, quite a long paper on this diamond model and how it seems to correlate with the different religious traditions. And I sent this paper to David Bohm, who was working in London at that point as a professor of physics at Birkbeck College. And he very kindly called me and invited me to have a discussion with him about the model. I think he was interested also in how it might relate to his own physics. And we had a wonderful conversation. And this was then published much later, like 25 years later, in a book called The Unity of Everything, which is my conversation with David Bohm. and it shows the details of this model and how that model points to this underlying unity behind all the different religious traditions. So that's a brief story of how the diamond model came to be.
Can you share what it represents, what the diamond model is about?
Yes, of course. So I probably need to bring up a slide for that, and then I can show you. So if you just give me a moment.
Sure.
So I've got a slide there. Can you see that okay, Sima?
Yeah.
Great. So this is the essential pattern that came to me in that meditation that morning in 1989, and which much more recently has come to be known as the diamond model. So I'll talk you through this slowly so we can get some idea of what's being said here. So the best place to actually start here would be at 2 levels up from the bottom. And there's a term I've used there called multiplicity. And by multiplicity, I simply mean the world of different things separated in space and different events separated in time. So this is the world of space-time, a 4-dimensional world of space-time, according to Einstein, in which we move and live and experience and perceive things most of the time. And for most people, this is simply the world in which we live. Now, many of the spiritual traditions, very explicitly in the East, and I think more implicitly in the West and in the Middle East, seem to say or seem to be talking about a deeper realm of being, a deeper realm of wholeness or unity that lies hidden behind this realm of multiplicity, and of which this realm of multiplicity is a manifestation or an appearance in some way. So if you see on the diamond model 2 levels from the top there, I've got what I've called the whole. So that is this underlying realm of wholeness that David Bohm called the implicate order, and that gives rise to this realm of multiplicity that David Bohm called the explicate order. And that implicate order, that wholeness, is in a way a deeper or truer reality that underlies this world of multiplicity. Now, again, many of the traditions try to explain why there is so much seeming suffering in the world, or why we seem to be under some kind of delusion that leads to conflict in the world. And if you look at all the different ways that the traditions and teachers explain this, it seemed to me that, in essence, if we really get down to the really essential insight here, what they were saying, or what they are saying, is that we run into problems when we live in the world of multiplicity, but we forget this underlying wholeness. So if this realm of multiplicity is divorced in our perception, it can never be divorced in reality, that wholeness is always there. But in our perception or experience, if that realm of multiplicity is divorced from that realm of wholeness, then the different parts that make up this realm of multiplicity become what we could call fragments. They're no longer parts, which are natural parts coming out of an underlying whole, but they now become fragments that have lost their connection to the whole in our perception. And then those fragments must necessarily lead to us living a life of fragmentation and seeing a universe of fragmentation. And it's that fragmentation that leads at root to all the different problems we have in the world. So I'll give you one very obvious example I always use here, which are the different races that the human species or the human race is made up of, allegedly, seemingly. So we have, the English race, the Chinese race, the Indian race, the American race, or nations. Now, those nations by themselves can be seen as parts, multiplicity, that emerge out of this underlying wholeness, which is the wholeness of the human race. But if we lose sight of that wholeness of the human race and just see these different nations divorced from that underlying wholeness, then those parts, the nations as parts, become nations as fragments. And then the nations can see each other as different, as enemies, as rivals, and go to war with one another because they've lost sight of that underlying wholeness that truly unites the human race beneath those differences. Another example would be the different religions of the world, and so on and so forth. There's many, many examples we could give. So that's what I was seeing being taught in many of the traditions, the whole, the part, the fragment. Then I was starting to look into, well, what is the process whereby the whole manifests as the part? How does wholeness become multiplicity? And many of the traditions talk about this intermediate realm that seems to exist between wholeness and multiplicity, which is sometimes referred to as the subtle realm. There's this subtle Platonic realm that acts as the intermediate state between wholeness and multiplicity. And one of the key things that happens at this subtle level is that as individuals, as apparent individuals, we create a distinction between ourselves as the subject and the world as an object. In other words, we create this subject-object dualism between the observer and the observed, between me and not me. And that initial distinction or dualism then proliferates and extrapolates into this world of many different parts. In a way, the subject-object distinction is the first multiplicity that takes place in our experience. So we have a process there whereby the whole splits in our perception into subject and object, and then the subject and object interact and extrapolate to produce this world of multiplicity. And then multiplicity becomes divorced in our perception from the whole, and we fall into fragmentation, which is where all of our problems happen. And that process whereby the whole manifests right down to fragmentation can be referred to as a process of creation. The whole creates the parts, and then we create the fragments. And the process whereby the fragmentation rediscovers multiplicity and then rediscovers the wholeness, we could refer to that as a process of evolution, whereby essentially we rediscover the whole. And we have this cycle going on between creation and evolution. And that takes place in many different ways. We can think of that taking place over the entire history of the universe. We can think of that taking place over one lifetime. And we can think of that taking place in each moment. In each moment, we're enacting this cycle of creation and evolution. So this diamond, if you like, is there at many different levels. It's like a fractal that appears in many different contexts. Ultimately, though, the ultimate experience or realization is that there's no real difference between the wholeness and the multiplicity. They're different aspects of the same true non-dual reality. And that's what I'm referring to at the top there as non-duality. So non-duality there is the non-duality between the whole and the parts. So that, in a nutshell, is the diamond model. And that's what I found to be a pattern that seems to occur in many different religious traditions. And more recently, I'm finding that this same pattern is occurring in many different fields that have nothing to do with religion, in art, in science, in politics, in economics, in sociology, and so on. So what I'd like to do, just to give a little bit of substance to this, is to actually show how, just to give one example, to show how this diamond model actually shows up in the Eastern mystical traditions. So I'll just move to the next slide there. And what I'm going to just quickly run through is how this diamond can be seen to manifest in the three main Eastern traditions of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Taoism. So we can start there with the wholeness there, which is what I've called the formless. So that formless, two levels down, that formless is the formless reality that lies behind our normal day-to-day appearance of things. And that's called in these three traditions, Brahman in Hinduism, emptiness or void or shunya in Buddhism, and the Tao in Taoism. They're different emphasis, different ways of expressing it, but essentially they're talking about this underlying formless realm. And as the formless starts to go through a process that I'm calling here involution, which is the opposite of evolution, that was talked about, that was a term coined, I think, by Aurobindo, the mystic Aurobindo. So how the formless starts to manifest as form, that initial separation, that initial dualism that takes place is between the subject and the object. And we can see these dualisms in Hinduism as Shiva and Shakti, the male and the female principle of the absolute. And we can see that this dualism in Taoism as the yin and the yang, which are the first two elements that emerge out of the Tao. And that separation takes place in the subtle realm, which lies between the formless and form. And then we come down, involution continues, and the subtle realm manifests as the world of form. So in Hinduism, the world of form, the multiplicity, is referred to as Leela. So the world of form is the play of God, the play of Brahman. In Mahayana Buddhism, it's referred to as the Manovijñāna. So this is the world of multiplicity created by the conceptual mind. It's the conceptual mind that creates these parts. And in Taoism, it's just referred to as the many, but the Tao becomes the one becomes the two becomes the many. And all these traditions also talk about how our perception of form can be divorced from the underlying experience of the formless. And when that happens, we lose sight of the form and formless, and we fall into delusion. And delusion there corresponds to what I referred to as fragmentation. And Hinduism refers to that delusion as Maya. This is the illusion of a world seen as separate from Brahman. In Mahayana Buddhism, we can refer to this as manas. This is where the conceptual thinking goes too far, sense perception takes its own perceived objects too seriously, we lose sight of the formless, we lose sight of emptiness, we fall into delusion. And in Taoism, this is referred to simply as disharmony. When the many moves away from the one, we move into a state of disharmony. We're no longer living in harmony with the Tao. And again, the process whereby delusion can be healed and we gradually move back to form, to the subtle, to the formless, we can think of that as this evolutionary process. And so we have this cycle of involution and evolution taking place in many different areas. But the highest realization in these traditions, once again, is that there's no ultimate difference between the formless and form. So ultimately, Brahman is the world. Ultimately, emptiness is form. Nirvana and samsara are one. The one is the many. And that's what I'm referring to there as the non-dual, which is the equivalence of formless and form. And when we realize that final non-duality, that can be said to be what all these traditions in their different ways refer to as enlightenment or final realization or final liberation. So that's a quick overview of the diamond model. So shall I stop the share, or did you want me to keep the slide up for a while? You've muted yourself, Suma. You've muted yourself.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I know you have compared this with also the scientific way of how this diamond model breaks down.
Yes, I have, yes.
Can you share the scientific side of it?
Yes, of course. So what I'll do is I'll go back to, I'll try to go back to, okay, just give me a moment. In fact, we don't really need the slide. I can just talk through this. So in the scientific version of the model, that level of wholeness, we could refer to that as that underlying energy of which the whole of the universe is made up. So, for example, Einstein said that E equals mc squared, a very famous equation. And I think what he meant by that is that in any particular element of matter, any element of matter contains within it a huge amount of energy, which can be calculated by multiplying matter by the square of the speed of light. So ultimately, matter is really just energy. So this entire world of matter, this entire world of separate things and events, which we call multiplicity in the diamond model, is really just energy scientifically. That's the E in E equals mc squared. So the wholeness would relate to what we could call in modern physics the realm of energy, or what David Bohm calls the implicate order. Now, the world of multiplicity that emerges out of wholeness, we could refer to that as the world of matter. That is actually the world of matter, the material world, which emerges from energy and which is a different form of that energy. And the fact that E and M are different forms of that same substance, effectively, is the non-duality that exists between energy and matter. That would be the scientific way of talking about non-duality. And also in science, whenever we have to have an experience of the world, there's always this presumed separation between the observer and the observed. So in order to perceive this world of matter, which is the world of multiplicity, we need to initially, in order to perceive it correctly, we need to initially make a separation between us as the observer and the world as the observed. And the scientific method has been set up in such a way that we can do that as accurately as possible, taking any biases or distorting influences of the observer out of the equation as far as possible. And the observer then the observed then becomes what we could refer to as the objective world. And that separation is necessary in order to do science and in order to be able to find out facts about matter. So the scientific version would be energy, separation between the observer and the observed, and the world of matter, the world of multiplicity, which the observer can discover through an objective evaluation of the observed. Now, if our evaluation of the observed is incorrect, we can fall into error, and then we're starting to see things in the world of matter or draw conclusions in the world of matter that are actually divorced from how energy and matter really are. And so we would then fall into fragmentation, which in the scientific context would simply be wrong views or wrong beliefs or an incorrect perception of the world. And that's when we've divorced ourselves from this reality, which is E, energy, and M, matter. So that is how we might apply the diamond model to science and the way scientists would seek to get accurate knowledge of the cosmos.
Thanks for that explanation, using different point of views, because that definitely makes it clear and easy to understand. And I noticed in both those slides, you have pointed out the evolution side of this model. And I would love to know your take from Advaita and Neo-Advaita perspective, because they both of them seem to be critical about evolution,
Right.
the concept of evolution.
Right.
So would love to know like how all of those different way of thinking fit together.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'll try to explain that now. I've actually done a third slide, which I'll try to bring up for this. So if you can bear with me just for a moment.
Sure.
So this is another diagram I did, which I hope will shed some light on this view of the Advaitins, that in fact there is no evolution, and how we can contrast that with those schools such as the teachings of Aurobindo that actually teach that there is an evolution, and how these two ways of looking at things might actually fit together. So if you see here, there's a circle, and this is a very simple depiction of how the Eastern traditions, which is what we're now focusing on, might see reality. So let's start on the right-hand side of the circle. So the right-hand side of the circle, this is the realm of form, what I earlier referred to as the subject-object dualism, and also the world of multiplicity. So this is the world of form. This is the world, the realm of experience, where we can actually experience things. And typically the Eastern traditions would talk about this world of form, or this world of light is another way of describing it, as being made up of three different levels or realms of experience: the gross, the subtle, and the causal. So the gross is what we can perceive through our senses. As we move, so that's like mountains and trees and rocks. As we move to a more refined view of reality, we move into the subtle realm. Now, the subtle realm is the realm of mystical experience. This is where we might experience deities, lights, sounds. And this is also the realm that we enter into when we're asleep at night in our dream state. So this is the subtle realm, which is the realm where most mystical experiences take place. And then right at the ground of the realm of form, at the top there, we have the causal realm. And the causal realm is that realm of nothingness, or no-thingness, or void, out of which everything emerges and back into which everything goes back. And that's the realm that we enter in various samadhi states that the Hindu tradition talks about, like nirvikalpa samadhi, for example, or that's the realm in Buddhism, which is the state of nirodha, where the mind is completely still and we have a direct perception of emptiness or no-thingness, nothingness. So on the right-hand side here, in the realm of form, essentially that causal, subtle, and gross is actually my diamond model. So the causal is the realm of wholeness, the subtle is the realm of subject-object, and the gross is the multiplicity. And these, like I've mentioned, these correspond to our three states, which we go through in a cycle every 24 hours. The gross is the waking state, the subtle is the dream state, the causal is the dreamless sleep state. Now, in this realm of form, gross, subtle, and causal, it does make sense to talk about involution and evolution, because how does the causal become the subtle? How does the subtle become the gross? Well, there's a process of creation, a process of involution that takes place either in time or in each moment. And then we have a process of evolution, again, whereby the gross returns to the subtle, and the subtle returns to the causal. And that's the process of evolution, which we've mentioned before in connection with the diamond model. So that entire circle of causal, subtle, gross, and back gross, subtle, causal is the involution and evolutionary process that is taking place. And that's all taking place only on the right side of the circle, which is the realm of form or the realm of light. Now, while all of this movement is taking place in the right side, in the world of form, in the world of light, there's another half of reality, if you like, that we're not taking into consideration there. And that is that consciousness, which we could call here divine consciousness, or we could call the witness consciousness that we can realize, that is always and already the case, no matter what is happening on the right side. So even while involution and evolution are going on, and all kinds of interesting things are going on in that realm of form and light, consciousness, or the witness state, or emptiness, is untouched. That's always and already the case, no matter what's happening on the right side. So reality, the whole of reality, can be said to have these two aspects: consciousness on the left side, which is always and already the case, and form and light on the right side, in which all these transformations are taking place between gross, subtle, and causal. And both of those sides of the equation, consciousness and form, are both equally true and equally important. And if you look at the bottom there of the diagram, when we realize the non-duality between consciousness and form, or consciousness and light, we can refer to that as conscious light. Everything is made up of this conscious light, which is both consciousness and form, consciousness and light. And that is also what Buddhists refer to when they talk in their deepest sense about emptiness being form. Now, back to your original question, now that I've laid out the framework here, what I think happens is that most teachers and most traditions emphasize only one half of this circle. So these two halves of the circle, consciousness and form, they actually correspond to different dualisms or different disagreements that you can see throughout all the teachers and throughout all the traditions. So the Advaita traditions, and particularly the Neo-Advaita tradition in the West in recent decades, emphasizes the left side consciousness to such an extent that it pretty much forgets about the right side, or it downplays the right side, or it says, well, the right side isn't important, it's an illusion, forget about it. On the other hand, there are other schools, such as the Kundalini schools, that only emphasize the right side. So they talk only in terms of evolution and transformation and movement of energies, and they can lose sight of the left side. They can lose sight of the fact that, well, yeah, all this is happening, but there's always consciousness as well. That's always and already the case. And my suggestion is that the true non-duality, the real ultimate nature of things, is both of these. And both of these have to be held together as of equal importance and as two aspects of the non-dual conscious light. Now, I'll tell you some of the playoffs that happen here, and I think this will shed a lot of light on the kind of debates we get in spiritual circles and why these debates are taking place and why all these disagreements are taking place. So consciousness and form we can refer to as the absolute and the relative. So consciousness is the absolute, form is the relative. Consciousness is Shiva, form is Shakti. Since consciousness is always and already the case, for consciousness, we don't need any practice, we don't need any effort, we don't need any seeking, because it's always and already the case. So when Advaitin teachers say, well, there's no practice, there's no effort, there's no seeking, they're absolutely right with regards to the left side of the circle. But they may be leaving a very important part of the puzzle out, which is they're ignoring the right side. Now, in the right side, because there are real transformations going on here between gross, subtle, causal, in the right side, we do need a practice. We do need effort. We do need seeking. So there's a playoff here between no practice, no effort, no seeking, and practice, effort, and seeking. And both are equally true. And there's a paradox here, because as soon as the conceptual mind tries to make sense of these two halves of reality, it's going beyond its capacity to create a coherent picture, because the conceptual mind simply cannot grasp non-duality, because the conceptual mind is dual by its very nature. And that's why we get these paradoxes. I'll give you a few more examples of these paradoxes. Consciousness is transcendent. Form and light is immanent. Where you have consciousness, enlightenment is sudden. Where you have form and light, enlightenment is gradual. So is enlightenment sudden or is it gradual? Well, it's both, depending on whether we're talking about consciousness or form and light. Another playoff here is predestination versus free will. Has everything been predestined? Or do we actually decide our destiny? Again, it's both. From the consciousness side of the equation, consciousness merely observes and witnesses the realm of form. So from the point of view of consciousness, form appears as if it's all been predestined. We don't play a part in that. However, from the point of view of form, we are existing as individuals within the realm of form, and we can influence our destiny. So there is free will. So again, there's both predestination, free will. Consciousness is the realm of the timeless. Form is the realm of time. In consciousness, there is nothing happening. In the realm of form, something is happening. So when teachers say, well, nothing is really happening, that's true at consciousness. But at the realm of form, something is certainly happening. Things are actually changing. And one of the favorite things Advaitin teachers say is that there's no story. Look at things without your story. Again, that's true in the realm of consciousness, but in the realm of form, there is definitely a story. And both of those are held together. So for me, my view is that if we realize just consciousness without form, everyone refers to that as non-duality. I don't think that's non-duality, because if you realize consciousness without including form, there is a very subtle dualism here, because you've left out form. So you're still holding on to this subtle dualism between consciousness and form. Real non-duality, or the final non-duality, I believe, occurs when even that distinction between consciousness and form is undone, and there's simply this conscious light. And when we try to express that conscious light in conceptual terms, we have to always talk in terms of these paradoxes that I've given you several examples of here. So what I'd also like to just briefly say is, I think there is a danger with emphasizing only the left side of the equation. So in the more extreme forms of Advaita, where we get teachers completely discarding the right side altogether, there's nothing happening, there's nothing you can do, there's no story, you don't even exist. Who's the one who's asking this question? This is the kind of more extreme Advaita view. I'll tell you a few areas where I think this more extreme view can be imbalanced and can lead to some difficulties. First of all, I think it's a compulsive absolutization of reality. We're only then, if we're holding to that teaching, we're only emphasizing the absolute, and we're even making the relative absolute. And in doing so, we're spiritually bypassing the relative by pretending the relative doesn't exist. And by telling people again and again, there's no practice, there's no effort, there's no story, you're not actually giving people anything they can do or not do in order to realize what the teacher is talking about. It becomes what we could refer to as a talking school. It ends up just being talk. And really, there's nothing to do then except to attend lectures of these teachers and just hear this verbal teaching again and again and again, and just hope to miraculously understand it somehow. And I think, again, that can be a dead end for seekers. And the danger can be that people can understand this consciousness teaching verbally, and they can really get it verbally, and then they think they've realized, but all they've actually done is take on board another belief system, which they then talk about. That's, I think, one of the dangers of this. Also, the more extreme Advaitin schools, they can have quite a condescending attitude towards other paths and practices. So there are a lot of paths and practices that concentrate on the right side. For example, the Kundalini practices of raising your Kundalini from gross to subtle to causal. Now, these are profound practices that have histories of thousands of years, but if one takes the more extreme Advaitin view that there's only consciousness, that kind of path, that kind of practice will just be written off as a lower practice or an illusory practice. It won't be accommodated. And actually, you can end up writing off everything except your own teaching, which is not a very, I don't think that's a very healthy approach. I think a more inclusive approach where every practice and every path is seen to be part of a bigger whole is just a more healthy way of relating to this world. I do think many of these Advaitin teachers have experienced some kind of shift. But I'd like to make a distinction as well here between what we could call a temporary state and a permanent structural shift. So I think it's possible for someone to have a temporary experience of consciousness or a temporary fall into the witness position, and then to just believe that's it. Now one is enlightened forever for the rest of their lives. But what many of these traditions have shown is that one can have temporary glimpses of consciousness and of the witness state, but a lot more work needs to be done to make this temporary glimpse into a permanent shift. And that permanent shift is what is real enlightenment, not just a more temporary or even superficial state experience. But I think the most dangerous aspect of the consciousness-only schools is that there is no longer any real basis for an ethical framework in the world of form. Because if all of this is an illusion, if form doesn't matter, if nothing is happening here, if it's just a story, if what happens here doesn't really matter, it's not ultimately real, then why would it matter if I just went out and just murdered somebody? What is the basis for a real ethical framework? What is the basis for making a distinction between good and bad or good and evil? What would that be based on if all distinctions are just part of a story? So this can be a danger of the more extreme Advaita views, that even if one realizes that, one no longer has a real solid basis for an ethical framework in the world of form. Whereas if we take on board this more non-dual approach, where we include both consciousness and also form, then is there an ethical framework? Yes and no. No, from the point of view of consciousness, but yes, because we are including form as equally real, we do then have a responsibility to behave ethically in this world, because all of this is also equally important. We give equal emphasis to both consciousness and also to form. So that would be my view at the moment on the Advaitin, more extreme Advaitin schools.
That was really well described, Nish, because it's very rare to find these insights, because usually it's one, as you mentioned, it's one or the other. It's either consciousness or all the activities that are happening within evolution.
Yes.
Because it's a paradox, it becomes difficult to talk about it, and it's hard to find speakers who are able to point out both sides of those paradox.
Mm-hmm.
And also the visual representation, it's kind of helps, even if it's at an intellectual level, it helps to make it easy to talk about some of these things. So really thank you for that slide.
Great,
and in our conversations, I remember you also mentioned something about Tantra. And I know Tantra is kind of misunderstood especially in the mainstream world. So can you explain non-duality from that perspective also?
Yes, of course. So yes, you're right. The tantric schools have been very misunderstood and very distorted in the way they have tended to be taught in the West. In the Western world, the tantric schools have basically just been about sex, whereas that plays a very small role actually in the traditional tantric schools. The traditional tantra is at its best precisely that bigger non-duality that I'm talking about. So Tantra will acknowledge the always already nature of consciousness, and it will also acknowledge the transformative, evolutionary processes taking place within form. And it will acknowledge that, well, the first is the absolute, the second is the relative. But in Tantra, they're both equally real. And ultimately, they're non-different. So when one reaches the ultimate state of tantric realization, one doesn't even see an absolute and a relative, they've become one. But when we're not realized, we need to see these as different for clarity. But unlike Advaita, Tantra doesn't see the world of form as unreal or unimportant. And precisely because of the different problems that I pointed out earlier. Probably the biggest problem that Tantra sees with Advaita is, well, if Brahman, which is the consciousness, if that's the only reality, then how does form happen? Where does form come from? Now, typically an Advaitan will reply by saying, well, that's Maya. And Maya is a projection onto Brahman. But this leads to all kinds of problems. If Maya is a projection onto Brahman, who's doing the projection? Where is this projection coming from? Is Brahman the same as Maya, or is it different? There's no really rigorous answers to these, or no clear answers to these. And eventually, I think Advaita ends up just getting into more and more complex verbal arguments to try to explain all of this. So Tantra is very much aware of these problems. One of the great tantrics was a great realizer called Abhinavagupta, who founded a school of Tantra called Kashmir Shaivism. And Kashmir Shaivism deals very well with these paradoxes and the difficulties of Advaita and the need to move to a more tantric perspective. So I'll talk a little bit more about what Tantra actually is. So unlike Advaita, because Tantra acknowledges the equal reality and equal importance of the right side, which is form, it gives you a lot of detailed practices. There are a lot of things that one can do in the realm of form in order to evolve within form and in order to realize consciousness. It's not something that you can't do anything. Because form is equally real, we can do things in the world of form. So typically the tantric will engage in different forms of practice like meditation, the use of mantras, the use of yantras, devotion to the guru, study and recitation of the scriptures, physical exercise, hatha yoga, pranayama, there's all kinds of practices that can be done in the realm of form in order to bring about the realization of consciousness and form. And unlike Vedanta, Tantra doesn't need to have a condescending attitude towards other paths and practices. For a tantric, every single path and every single practice, including Vedanta, is seen as belonging to one of the stages of development that we work through in order to realize enlightenment. Because we are now including form on the right side, which is the realm of time, we're able to talk in terms of stages. So devotional schools like Bhakti are at a certain stage. The Kundalini realizers are at a certain stage. Vedantists and Buddhists are at a certain stage. Tantrics are at a certain stage. So everybody's right at their own stage. So it's a very inclusive school, which real non-duality has to be. And it includes within itself every possible dualism as a stage in the journey. Now, the other difference, I think, is that in Tantra, there is a big distinction made between having a temporary glimpse of realization and actually having a permanent shift, which is enlightenment. And whereas in Vedanta, anybody can claim to have realized. But if you ask them, well, where's the evidence you've realized? Because the relative world is unreal, and the relative world is where evidence will be shown, the Vedantic realizer will find it very difficult to actually provide evidence that they have realized. And in fact, they will see the whole question as nonsense. I mean, if you typically say to a Vedantist, well, how do I know that you've realized? They will probably answer by saying, oh, but who is the one who is asking this question? So they'll engage in what I think is this kind of verbal gymnastics in order to dismiss the question, because they're dismissing form. In Tantra, because of the relative is equally real as the absolute, it is possible to ask that question. And a tantric realizer, a true tantric guru, will have to show evidence in the relative world. How do they think? How do they talk? How do they behave? And one would need to see signs of real, unmistakable signs of realization in that relative world before that person can be accepted as a truly enlightened being. And that's why in Tantra, enlightened beings are very rare, because it's actually very difficult to reach a stage of permanent realization where you can show this evidence in the relative world. Also in Tantra, and we can talk about this when we have a second conversation, perhaps, is that in Tantra, the body, the human body, is seen as a microcosm of the whole of reality. So if you recall that circle that I showed you earlier, you had consciousness on the left side, you had gross, subtle, causal on the right side, and that was the structure of reality. That's also the structure of the human body. So in the human body, we've got a right side, which is where our always already consciousness resides. That is where the Atman or the Paramatman resides. That is where we're already realized. And on the left side of the body, just talking metaphorically here, on the left side of the body, you have the evolutionary chain of the gross, the subtle, and the causal. And that's, if you like, the spine where you have the Kundalini Shakti moving up and down. So because a tantric sees the human body as a microcosm of this whole of reality, the tantric can use the body to realize reality. Because if they realize or awaken different aspects of the body, such as their subtle heart, or the highest Kundalini chakra, or the heart chakra to the right, what they're really doing, because the body is a microcosm of the whole, what they're really doing is they're realizing that aspect of reality to which this part of the body corresponds. So the body becomes the doorway through which we can realize. So realization is not any longer just a question of hearing these clever talks again and again, and then one day you get it. That's not enlightenment at all. Enlightenment takes place when we, in Tantra, when we use the microcosm of the body to access reality, and when we awaken fully the entire body-mind complex. So the entire body-mind complex awakens as this instance of conscious light. That is how we realize the conscious light of the whole of the cosmos, because our body is the cosmos. So we have a very real body-based practice that we can use. And the final, most important point I'll say is that the most radical schools of Tantra, they realize non-duality so fully that they not only do they not see any distinction anymore between consciousness and form, or between the absolute and the relative, they don't even see within the realm of form any distinction anymore between what is conventionally regarded as pure and what is conventionally regarded as an obstacle to enlightenment. So in the more traditional schools, there are various things that are considered to be obstacles to enlightenment. For example, money, eating meat, alcohol, drugs, sex. These are often things that the practitioner has to renounce. And then they need to take up a more ascetic practice. Because what you're really doing then is you're renouncing form, you're repressing form, you're suppressing all these natural desires in form in order to bring about a realization of consciousness. That's the more traditional ascetic approach. Tantra, because it's so radically non-dual, turns this on its head and actually says, well, far from being an obstacle to realization, these things in the world of form that are traditionally seen as obstacles are actually doorways to enlightenment. So we can use money, we can eat meat, we can use alcohol, we can take drinks that alter our consciousness, we can engage in sexual rituals, and they themselves become the doorways through which we can realize non-duality, because there's no difference between the pure and the impure. Now, this aspect of Tantra is referred to as the left-hand path of Tantra. Rather predictably, this is the path that everyone's interested in, and this is the path that has become well-known and sensationalized in the West. So everybody seems to think that tantrics just sit around getting drunk and having sex, but actually in the traditional, more serious forms of Tantra, these kind of left-hand path practices are only suitable for very advanced practitioners, and they have to be done in a very serious ethical framework under the guidance of a guru. So it's not just this rave and orgy, it's a very serious practice. And that's one of the big misunderstandings in the West. But in the East, the way it's performed in the East, it actually gives us a very profound insight into how radically non-dual reality really is. And even the distinctions that we traditionally make between good and bad are ultimately dissolved in the non-dual. And so both halves of that dualism, the good and the bad, can be used as doorways to realize the non-duality that lies behind those dualisms. And that, I think, is the genius of Tantra, but it's also a path that is very much open to misuse, obviously.
Yeah, it reminds me of that quote. I'm not sure who said it. It's probably Gurdjieff. He talks about how we are not really conscious, but we think we are. Mm-hmm. So it seems like the tantric way of practices stresses on increasing that consciousness, because a lot of processes, even at the body level, that happens, we are not conscious of them. They are just happening on their own. So to open, it seems like Tantra seems to point in that direction where those things can be opened up.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I mean, a tantric analysis of why are we not enlightened, what is producing fragmentation, is a tantric would probably talk in terms of what they would call a self-contraction. So the body and the mind in the fully enlightened state for a tantric would be a body and the mind that's radically open. Every single channel and every nadi and every bindu, everything would be radically open. And in that radical state of openness and surrender, at a bodily, mental and bodily level, and actually body and mind become one in that state, we realize the radical nature of open reality. So a lot of the practices in Tantra are about identifying and releasing all of these contractions. And of course, we need practices for that and we need time for that. It's not something that you can just say to somebody and they're going to get it. It's a process over decades that leads to full realization. Yeah.
Can you give like people who are not familiar with spiral dynamics, can you give a gist of like what spiral dynamics, how spiral dynamics represent evolution in that sense?
Yes, certainly. So I'll just say a word or two about what spiral dynamics is, and then I'll bring up a diagram that I can walk through. So if you remember on the right side of the circle, or even in my diamond model, there is a movement from multiplicity to wholeness, or from gross to subtle to causal. And that process of evolution, we've referred to that as evolution. Now, spiral dynamics is one particular model of evolution that I found to be very powerful, that describes some of the different stages that one would go through as one evolves to more and more subtle levels of form. So I'll bring up a slide, which I think will be very useful in just going through these different levels. So if you bear with me for a moment. So there we go. Is that okay? Can you see that?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So this is a description or a diagram of the different stages of development, what we call the altitudes of development, as human beings evolve from the most fragmented or the most divorced from the whole towards stages very slowly. This process takes place over hundreds of thousands of years, very slowly to greater and greater stages of wholeness, and eventually from gross to subtle. So I'll run through these fairly quickly. So the lowest level of development in human development is what we call archaic, or the color beige. This is when human beings first become aware of themselves, the beginning of self-awareness. At this stage, we're just living with instinct, intuition, the beginnings of banding with others. There's no real conceptual thinking here. We're just doing what we need to do to survive. And that started about 250,000 years ago. Then about 50,000 years ago, I think human beings started to see, well, there's value in banding with others and creating tribes. So we moved to the indigenous or the purple level of development, where we start to move to a type of consciousness that's more symbolic. We start to create symbols in our minds, and we band together with other people who have similar symbols, and we create the tribe. It's at this level we start to see the emergence of magic, magical rituals, shamanic rituals. We start to see the world as enchanted, and our sense of individuality is subordinate to the sense of community. It's the tribe that comes first at this level. Then about 15,000 years ago, we see the emergence of red. Now, what happens here at red is that the people start to feel too much constrained by the limitations of their community. and they develop an ego for the first time. They develop a clear sense of being a separate self for the first time, who wants to separate himself or herself from the tribe and go his or her own way. And what we see here is the beginning of an aggression that's needed in order to push one's own individual agenda ahead of the tribal community and the needs of the tribe. And this is where we see the beginning of empires, impulsive people in ruthless empires. But we also see here the birth of the hero, the courageous, determined, powerful hero. Now, about 5,000 years ago, we see another huge shift, where we see a shift from this red egocentric level to the more traditional religious level of development, which we could call the traditional level, or what spiral dynamics calls blue. Here again, what human consciousness starts to realize is that, well, there's only so much I can do from the point of view of an ego. And if the ego is just going around doing whatever it wants to do, there are limitations to my ability to survive. So it's going to be more workable if we bring in some kind of belief system that can unify a larger number of people and bring this kind of madness of the ego run amok into some kind of ordered whole. And this is where we see the birth of the nation, the birth of ethnicity. We see here rules and roles and discipline, the birth of morality. And to bring about that order, we see the birth of the traditional religions. So we see a faith in a transcendent God, a transcendent order. So this was like the beginnings of, say, Judaism with the call of Abraham in the Bible. This is the beginnings of the more sophisticated forms of Hinduism we get in the later Vedas, the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita. And this shift really took place in a very big way around 600 BC, where we saw a real shift to the more advanced forms of religious belief. Now, about 300 to 500 years ago, we saw the next big shift, which was the beginning of modernity. We'd already seen a little bit of this in ancient Greece with Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, but now it really came online in a big way at the Western Renaissance in Florence about 400, 500 years ago. And here we saw the birth of rationality in science, which starts to question the beliefs of the religion that we saw at Blue. And with this rational scientific thinking, we see the birth of individuality, we see the birth of democracy, we see capitalism, we see materialism. And now we have to move away from that security of religion, that security of Blue, and start risk-taking and relying on ourselves. This is the birth of individuality. Most of the world today is still blue and orange. A lot of the Eastern world is now making the transition from blue to orange. And a lot of the Western world is now making the transition from orange to the next level, which I'm going to talk about now, which is green. So the green level really started in a big way about 50 years ago in the 1960s, where there started to come a questioning of the more dogmatic view of science and rationality, that only reason and science is correct, and the kind of stratification of society that took place as a result of capitalism. So at Green, we saw pluralism. We value every culture, equality. We want social justice. We want people to be equal. We have to be sensitive to other people's feelings. Everybody's right in their own way. Everybody has civil rights. We want to fight against racism. We have to look after the environment. And it's the whole world that is important, not just our country. So that's the green postmodern level that started about 50 years ago. Now, even green has started to move into the next level, which we could call the integral level, which is the yellow level. And now we're looking at a very small percentage of people here, because we're moving into the cutting edge, the leading edge of where evolution is at the moment. So green reaches its limit because green, even though green is a really wonderful level, it can lead to two really big problems when taken to extremes. It can lead to what we could call nihilism. What nihilism means is that green wants to give an equal say to everybody and an equal value to every point of view. When we do that, there's no longer any absolute truth left anymore. There's just lots of relative truths. That means there's no real meaning to life anymore because nothing is true in any absolute sense. We've got rid of the absolute, and that can lead to a form of being in this world that we can call nihilistic, and that can even lead to existential depression and anxiety. Also, green can lead to narcissism, because if my point of view is equally good as yours, then I could take a narcissistic view which says, well, I'm right, this is what I believe, you can't tell me what to do, I can do whatever I want to do. And we can see that attitude quite a lot, I think, in the boomer generation today, in the youth of today, who have been brought up in a very green environment, and they've lost complete sight of the good things that can be there in blue and orange. So what happens is that another level has to emerge, and that level we can call teal or yellow. And the integral level actually starts to see that all of these levels from beige all the way up to green are valuable. They all have their own value. They all have something to contribute. And they all exist in a relationship of evolution with one another. What we're talking now, this discussion about spiral dynamics, is coming from a yellow integral point of view, because it's at yellow that we start to see these levels for the first time. And then we can integrate everybody's point of view in this developmental scheme. Now, and we can also hold all these perspectives at the same time, which means we're not really in opposition to anybody, because anybody we come across, we can see where they're coming from. Everybody has something useful to contribute to the table. Now, yellow can end up being very intellectual, like this spiral dynamics model is very intellectual. What happens from yellow to turquoise is that this realization of evolutionary development starts to come alive in us, in our body. So we don't just understand evolutionary development in this intellectual way that we do at yellow or teal. We actually start to see it and feel it in our bodies. We see the world as alive and evolving. We see our bodies as a microcosm of the world, and our bodies are evolving. And we can live from both an individual self and also from a transpersonal self point of view. So that circle that I earlier talked about, consciousness and form, and that tantric view, that would possibly be coming from this turquoise level. And the final realization, or the beginnings of true realization, would be even beyond turquoise at these post-integral levels, which begin with indigo or coral. And that's where we start to truly realize the oneness of the world. We start to manifest wisdom, joy, and love. We actually start to become saints and sages. So this is that, what I talked about in Tantra, that the evidence of realization, you'd want to see that evidence in the world of form. That may start to happen here at the indigo coral level of development. So that, again, very quickly, is one model of how we might see form developing through time. And also that development that human beings have gone through historically, children and adults, we also go through that as we grow up as well. So the evolution of a child, teenager, adult, actually ends up going through the same levels in a similar way to the levels that humanity has gone through over 250,000 years. So we see that involution, evolution cycle happening in different contexts, in the context of history, and also in the context of any one human life. So that's a brief introduction to spiral dynamics. You've muted yourself.
As an example to understand this a bit more deeply, can you take a concept like death and how understanding of death would evolve in a spiral dynamics point of view?
Yes, that's a really good example to take, because that's something we're all afraid of, and it's something we never really talk about. So let's see how our understanding of death might evolve through these levels. And then hopefully we'll get a better understanding of how these levels operate. So at the level of beige, we'll start at the bottom. There's no real sense of self at this level. So at that level, we're still fused with nature. And so we don't really have any concern with death. We don't really have any concept of death. Like animals don't really have any concept of death, because they don't have a sense of self existing in time. So at beige, we are blissfully ignorant. We're living in this pre-personal paradise, the Garden of Eden, where we have no concern or worry about death at all. Now we move up to purple here, to magic, the magical level. Now here, our sense of self starts to emerge, but it's not a separate ego yet. At this stage, our sense of self is what we could call a membership self. In other words, our self is the tribe. The tribe as a whole is our self. So at this level, we've started to separate from nature a little bit. And we don't have a fully fledged ego yet, but we have separated enough from nature that when we look at nature, we can see at this level, when we see things happening like the rain or the sun rising in the morning, our crops are growing or whatever, we see or we assign some kind of agency, some kind of intentional agency to those happenings. In other words, what we believe at this level is that whenever these things happen in the world, somebody's doing it. There's something behind that happening that's intentionally bringing this happening about. And because of that, we create or believe in this spirit world. So at magenta purple, we believe that beyond this world of people and the material world, there is an invisible spirit world. And all the happenings in the world take place because of the actions of this spirit world. And when our ancestors have died and moved on, they've gone to be in this spirit world. So at this level, death means leaving this world and going and living in the spirit world, going and living with the spirits, living with our ancestors. So even at this level, there's no real fear of death. We have a concept of death now, or at least a symbol of death. But there's no reason to fear, because we believe that we will just be translated into this spirit realm or this ancestor realm, and we'll be reunited with these spirits and ancestors who are helping us all along. Now, the real shift, one of the real shifts happens when we move to red. At this point, we develop our sense of separate self, what we could call a first person perspective. And now, we become the ego. We are the agent of our own lives, not just the tribe. And because there's a general rule at every level here, which is that how we perceive the world and how we perceive spirit is a projection of how we perceive ourselves. So if at the red level, we're perceiving ourselves as a separate ego, we perceive the spirit world as being made up of lots of separate egos. So this is where we believe that the spirit world is made up of lots of gods, lots of powerful gods. So you have all the gods of ancient Greece, ancient Rome, all the Hindu gods, all the Hindu goddesses. These are the projection of the red ego projecting itself onto these different powerful gods in the spirit realm. So for a red, someone who's at red, when the ego dies, what the red consciousness believes is that we will simply continue to live as an ego in the realm of these power gods. So, for example, in the ancient Norse myths, one could die and then go and live in Valhalla, which is the realm of the Viking gods, or in the Mahabharata, or the great Hindu epic. At the end of the Mahabharata, when the Pandavas, the heroes of the Mahabharata, die, they all go to the realm to be with the rest of the family that have passed on, but also with all the gods who are living there. So again, death is nothing too much to be afraid of, because the ego is immortal, and the ego will continue to live in its own projected world of these egoic gods. And all the gods in this world are actually very egotistical gods. They all fight each other for power, because we've just created those gods in the image of our own ego. That's how the red heaven works. As we move from red to blue, we typically now see ourselves not so much just as a separate ego, but we now see ourselves in terms of our nation, our tradition, our community. Now, any tradition, most traditions believe in some kind of life after death, but being able to be accepted into this life after death, into a good place at any rate, depends on what we've believed and how we've behaved during our lives. So for somebody at blue, for somebody who's practicing a blue religion, let's take two examples, Hinduism or Buddhism rather, Buddhism and Christianity. Now, in Christianity, death is nothing to be feared if you're accepted into heaven after you die. But there's a lot to fear if you go to hell after you die. So what is happening here at the blue level is that because we've identified now with the tradition that we're following, whether we go to a good or a bad place after we die depends on how well we followed that tradition. So if we followed Christianity really well, we've believed in the right things, we've done the right things, we'll be accepted into that Christian heaven. If we haven't done those things, if we haven't believed in the right things, we'll go to the Christian hell. Similarly, in Buddhism, if we live in a right way and create good karma, our next rebirth will be a better birth. Same in Hinduism. If we create bad karma, if we don't follow the rules of that religion, blue is all about rules, then we'll have a very bad rebirth. In our next rebirth, we might be reborn as a mosquito, which wouldn't be a nice life to live. So blue sees death as something to be feared or rejoiced in, depending on how one has lived one's life. So all of these levels from beige to blue, they form what we can refer to as the pre-rational levels, because rationality starts at orange. Now, all of these pre-rational levels, if you see, they've all created some kind of belief system that acts as a constellation for death. So death is nothing too much to be worried, because if we do the right things, we'll go somewhere nice. All of that is destroyed at orange, pretty much, because orange comes along with its rationality and its science. And at orange, at blue, we had a second person perspective. If you remember, I said red had a first person perspective. It's all about the ego. At blue, we have a second person perspective. So it's all about our community, our tradition. At orange, we develop third-person perspective, which means that we can look at the world objectively. When we do that, our sense of self changes. It becomes just this body and this brain. If you ask a scientist, what is the self? They will say, well, it's your body and your brain. And that body and that brain is going to die and disintegrate and rot away. And because that's who your self is, that self is going to die. So at the orange level, basically, there is no afterlife, generally speaking, because the death of the body is the death of the self. So it's at orange that fear of death can really emerge in a very, very big way, because we no longer, we're too highly developed now to be able to believe in these consolation, magic, and mythology. However, orange has to function in the world. So how does orange deal with this fear of death? What orange tends to do is it tends to repress this fear, or it tends to sublimate this fear by putting all that fear into ambition and into life projects in the real world. So someone who is orange will typically be keeping really busy trying to achieve things in this world. And by doing that, the fear of death, which is always in the background because the consolation beliefs have gone, that fear of death is repressed, or it's poured into this achievement project. So somebody at orange will typically say, well, I want to create something great that will live after me after I die. I want to write a book or create a building. After I'm gone, I'll still be there. I'll still be remembered. That's how orange may typically try to overcome the fear of death, by creating these symbols about itself through which it will carry on living. Okay, so now we move to green. Now, green, we move to what we could call a fourth person perspective. So now the sense of self is no longer very easily definable, because we've now got lots of selves and lots of roles we can play, because we're now in this pluralistic space. And we no longer have this essence that defines ourself. So I think at green, I don't think tends to think about death too much, because green is more preoccupied with getting its freedom and its liberty in this life. Because green is all about our rights and our freedom to live life the way we see fit. And that way could be any way of all these different pluralistic options. So I think what green fears more than death is it doesn't think about death too much, I don't think. Green tends to fear something different. Green fears its hindrance to liberty. So green is always fighting for its freedom and liberty. And in so doing, it doesn't tend to think about death too much. It forgets about death to some degree, because its attention is on something else. Where spirituality may re-emerge in green, because spirituality tends to disappear in orange mostly, but where spirituality may reappear in green, we may start to take on this kind of new age belief that, well, it's all part of the process. When I die, I'll just be recycled as something else, or I'm really just one with everything. But at green, this tends to be more of a belief system rather than a real, true realization, I think. So we can put a lot of the new age beliefs or hippie beliefs at this level as well. So we move to yellow. Now, this is where things get more interesting. At yellow, our sense of self is, because at yellow, we become aware of evolution for the first time. So at yellow, our sense of self-definition is we are an evolving consciousness. We are consciousness, but that consciousness is evolving. Now, as our consciousness evolves and it reaches yellow, one of the things that happens in yellow is that our conceptual mind, which was so strong from red up to early yellow, the conceptual mind starts to wind down. The mind starts to become more quiet at yellow. And when concept starts to wind down, fear starts to wind down. So we're still very much aware of death, But because most fears are the result of image making and concept creation, as concepts start to wind down in yellow, fear starts to wind down in yellow. So this is the level where fear of death genuinely starts to dissolve, simply because of the way our consciousness is evolving. Now, this is not fear of death being put to one side because of beliefs, which it was in pre-rational, and we're not suppressing it like we were in orange. We're not just forgetting about it like we were in green. We're in full awareness of it, but the fear of it starts to go. And when we move to turquoise, where we start to see our body and mind as a unity, where we start to see the body as a microcosm of the evolution of the whole cosmos, our sense of self at this point has become, or starts to become, so large that the death of this one individual body or this one individual mind starts to become a bit of an abstraction, because we're starting to identify ourselves with something so much bigger than this body, that the death of this body is not that important anymore, because our perspective has become so much bigger. And we don't even think about it or feel it so much anymore, because we're more in touch with the unity of all things. And death has become this, the death of the body has become this rather small, abstract part or even fragment. And when we move finally into coral, our sense of self is now the whole of nature. We now identify with everything that exists. So even if the body and mind die, who cares? Because the body and the mind isn't who I am anymore. I have now achieved at this level of coral indigo a sense of oneness, a realization of oneness with everything. And everything isn't going to die. So that's the real immortality, not some kind of belief system at red or blue. Real immortality is the realization that who you really are is the whole, not just this body. And when that realization takes place, fear of death is gone, because that whole, which is who you've now identified with, is beyond death. So that's a quick run through of how we could see the evolution of the death concept through our different levels of evolution, right from beige right up to coral there.
Yeah, it seems like up until yellow, it's more, death is processed more at a conceptual level, where it's either like consolation stories or or at a rational level, it's more like a rigid cutoff, like this death is it's a done deal. There's nothing after death. So, but after yellow, it's more at an experiential level where that fear starts dissipating. And on the other complementary side, also the way you handle grief, I feel like changes, because at orange, it's still like there can be confusion, uncertainty, but with yellow, it may be experienced at, there's less grief when you start seeing that more clearly at an experiential level versus just like a concept.
I mean, yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, if we divide the spiral very roughly into three areas, you've got the pre-rational up to blue, you've got the rational, which is sort of orange, early green, and then you've got the trans-rational, which is green, yellow, turquoise, coral. I think there are three different ways of dealing with grief. The pre-rational, it'll grieve, certainly, but it'll take consolation in a belief. So a Christian, their child dies, they will say, well, it's fine, the child is with Jesus now. That's the sort of blue way of dealing with death, as an example. Orange will grieve. It will probably believe that that's the end. The child has just disappeared and that's it. You're never going to see them again. That's just life. And it will seek to accept it and get over it in some way. What happens, I think, at yellow turquoise, as you rightly say, because we're going beyond the conceptual mind, our sense of identity expands to include much more than just this individual conceptual self. And so death is no longer seen as being of that much significance, because death is to be feared because it's the death of self. If self is now seen as much more than the body-mind, the death of the body-mind is no longer so much to be feared. But there is a really important point here, which is that as we move up levels, those previous levels don't disappear. They're still there within us because we were at those levels at some point in the past, because everybody is born at age. So let's assume, for example, that I'm at yellow. Let's just assume that. I'm still going to have red, blue, orange, green within me, and I'm able to access those, and my body mind is able to go back to those when it is required. So someone who is at yellow and turquoise, even if their center of gravity is yellow turquoise, if there is a tragedy, they lose their child, they may, in a period of grief, they may temporarily go down to red and blue. Temporarily. So they may, because red and blue is still inside them, so they may go down to red and have a period of anger. Then blue, they may try to console themselves for a while, but it won't stick because their evolution has really gone beyond that. And they may then find themselves going through a grief process where, say they've gone down to red in anger, gradually over the coming months and years, they'll start to move from red to blue to orange to green to back to yellow again. They won't just be stuck at a lower level. And also the other important point is that somebody who's yellow and turquoise has a deeper understanding of what levels other people are at. So even if, say, I'm yellow turquoise, for example, and so death for me is seen in a much bigger context and isn't going to result in the same degree of long-term grieving, I can still perceive that maybe my friend is blue, orange, red. So when I'm dealing with my friend, I'll have to develop that whole spiral intelligence. I can't go up to my friend and expect him to be yellow. I will have to accommodate the fact that my friend is still red and blue. So we have to develop this whole spiral intelligence and meet people where they are at their level of grieving and the way that they're grieving. Because if you say to somebody who's at blue, it doesn't really matter if your child has died because who we really are is the whole cosmos, then they're going to think you're mad. They're not going to know what you're talking about. And they're actually going to be very angry because they'll think you're dismissing their very real grief. So when we're dealing with people at lower levels, at earlier levels, not low and high, earlier levels, we have to develop that intelligence that I think comes on board at yellow, which is that we have to start meeting people where they are, because different people are at different stages. And I think that applies to everything, and especially to grief and suffering.
Yeah, and it can be a very, especially that concept or that experience can be very difficult phase of evolution because it's one of the most challenging ones to overcome. But I've also the sense of like in yellow and turquoise, it seems like a sense of like nothing is lost. It's like it's always there. That sense, it's more at an experiential level versus new age story, consolation story level, which is different. That's why that doesn't feel like a real healing, because it's not a genuine experience. But it seems like at yellow and turquoise, it actually that potential of it being an actual genuine experience starts opening up.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Belief doesn't heal anybody, because where we need healing is not at the level of belief. Where we need healing is at the level of feeling and emotion. And belief is a conceptual thing. So we can sit there trying to believe as much as we want, but we're not addressing the real problem at the level at which it's occurring, which is the experiential level of the body and the feelings. So at yellow, and especially at turquoise, we deeply, for the first time in our evolution, rediscover and re-inhabit all those feelings and emotions and aspects of the body that we had repressed and suppressed all the way up. Because if you see people from purple and especially red, blue, orange, there's a lot of repression and suppression going on. Even if you look at the way most people hold themselves, they're holding their bodies really tight. And that's a symptom of all this pre-rational feelings and emotions that they're keeping under control so they can function in the world. One of the things, and that's why they need beliefs at a conceptual level to help them cope and navigate. But those griefs and feelings and sufferings are still there under the surface. And if they're not truly dealt with, they can manifest as physical disease, for example. What happens at turquoise, especially, because we go beyond the conceptual mind, and in a way we fall into the body, in a really tantric way, actually, we fall deeply into the body and rediscover the wholeness of body and mind, because our minds are not just here, our minds in truth fill up our body. The body-mind dualism is just a dualism. Actually, the whole body is our mind. And if we suppress aspects of the mind, and if we suppress feelings, they will be suppressed and stored in different parts of the body, which will come out as disease. And belief is not going to help you there. What happens at turquoise, I feel, is that we go back and rediscover and re-allow the emergence of all these things we've spent our whole life repressing. And so turquoise goes through this real healing process whereby the mind and the emotions are rediscovered, and that distinction, dualism between the body and mind is healed. And the body mind, there's a body-mind wholeness that is rediscovered. And that is where, and that's the only place where real, true, profound healing can take place, because we're healing it at the level, we're healing suffering at the level that it really occurs, which is at the level of feeling. I think some of the earlier belief systems, especially green, may have intuitions of this, but an intuition or a belief has to become a whole body realization for it to be true and real. And going back to what we were talking about before, this is why I think the Vedantic talking schools don't work ultimately, because they're just conceptual. You can tell people night and day, well, it's just a story. It's not really happening. You don't really exist. That's not going to help someone whose child has just died. Yeah. You have to, for real healing to work, you have to acknowledge the reality of the problem. You have to acknowledge at the feeling level the reality of the tragedy. And that is the tantric approach and the turquoise approach. You feel it. If you can't feel it, you can't heal it. You've got to feel your whole body, and the whole body has to heal. And that is the only, in my humble opinion, that's the only place where healing can happen for the individual and for community.
I feel like that also clears up confusion about when some of these things are talked about at orange or green in New Age circles about healing. Sometimes like it doesn't feel like healing, although there is a lot of talk about it, and there can be a bit of bypassing. It can be confused with yellow or turquoise, but it's actually green or orange, where it's at a conceptual level, where it's actually those stories could repress or underemphasize someone's suffering.
Oh yes, completely. And the great sign that you're dealing with something that's orange and green rather than yellow and turquoise is that they're in denial of something. Something is being denied. Now, typically in New Age circles, for example, you have this thing known as the secret. where you can manifest whatever it is you want if you just think positively enough. Now that for me is another form of spiritual bypassing, because it's this extreme form of positive thinking. When you tell somebody you've got to be positive, 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 positive all the time, you're suppressing and spiritually bypassing the negative. And the negative is just as real, just as important as the positive. And you will find enlightenment and God in the negative as much as you will find it in the positive. And at yellow and turquoise, that pressure to deny the bad stuff is gone. And we give permission to ourselves, to our body, to our minds, to experience anything that's coming up, however bad it might be. And we allow ourselves to face the pain, to really feel the pain, to go through the pain, and to find the light that's on the other side of the pain. And you can't find that through belief, and you can't find that through any kind of denial or bypassing. So spirituality and healing of any kind, I believe, for it to be complete, true, radical, effective, it has to be whole bodily, whole feeling, and whole mind. Nothing can be left out. People want to leave that stuff out, partly because of their level of development and partly because some of that stuff is just too painful to go through. But if you don't feel the pain and go through the pain, you're not going to find the light at the other side. That's the deal here in this manifest world, I'm afraid.
Thank you for this beautiful conversation. It's really one of the most clear conversation I've had on Advaita and non-duality. I feel like we covered a lot of good pointers in our conversation, and I'm definitely very much looking forward to our second conversation and go deeper into Kundalini experiences. I feel like that will be equally insightful and beneficial. Today's talk was definitely very insightful for me. I sincerely want to thank you for that.
You're very welcome, Suma. Thank you so much for having me on this conversation. It's been really wonderful to meet you and speak with you. Thank you.
Same here. I'm very much looking forward to our second conversation. And if someone wants to find out more about your work and your books, I think your website is integraldream.com.
Yes, correct. It's integraldream.com. Everything is on there. My books, papers, audios, videos, conferences. And there is a facility on there to contact me if anyone wants to contact me. But yeah, that's my portal to everything that I'm doing at the moment. Yeah. And yeah, I would love to have a second conversation with you. And we can, talk about Kundalini in more detail. And we can also look at other aspects of spiral dynamics and evolution in more detail as well.
Yeah, definitely. I'm very interested. I think this is something, for me, at least based on what I researched, I think it's very rare to find what you have pointed out. So thank you for your brilliant work.
Oh, thank you very much. You're welcome. And I'm glad to be of service.
Thank you.
Thank you.